being in dark places. I'm worried about this dress. I'm worried you can see through it and see my underwear. Don't tell me. But it is a cabaret, so it's all right. We started, of course, with Francis Bickmore and Hope. Now comes despair. Not really. This year, Scotland was named the most beautiful country in the world by the Rough Guide. And as is the way of things, they may choose somewhere else next year, Fiji or somewhere. But for some of us, Scotland will remain the country that makes our hearts sing. And we know it's not all hills and glens, moody skies and sparkling lochs. You just have to step out the door into Lothian Road to see that. Scotland is many things, not all of them conventionally beautiful. But this is the place that made us. Muriel Spark, whose centenary we're going to celebrate next year, lived in England, Africa, America, and Italy. She lived outside Scotland much longer than she lived in it, and she was never quite sure in her lifetime if she was accepted as a Scot. But nevertheless, she described herself as Scottish by formation. And I've always liked that phrase, Scottish by formation. This is the place that even when we rail against it, helps to form our thinking and shape our writing. Scottish literature is almost as diverse as the country's landscape. It is urban streets and rough sleepers, distant islands that aren't distant when you live there, landed estates, concrete schemes, and so much more. Is our literature diverse enough? Have a look. Look around the room. Make up your own mind. Today, as it's already been mentioned, is the International Day of the Imprisoned Writer. And some years ago, I met a Burmese screenwriter, and he'd been jailed several times for his writing. And he was amazed to discover not only can we write what we like without fear of prosecution, but that we might even be funded to make a work which is critical of our government and our social structures. And he said that he envied the confidence of a democracy that could support what in other regimes might be considered dangerous writing. And I'm sure there are moments when Scottish policymakers read books written in Scotland and wring their hands and wish they could persuade Scottish writers to follow the tourist trail. But the freedom to dissent is part of what people beyond our shores often admire about our nation. Scotland is notoriously a small country with a very long reach. And I visited Samoa last year. This is why they asked me to do the international bit, because it's all about what I did on my holidays. I went to Samoa last year to pay my respects to Robert Louis Stevenson. And he's a hero there as he is here, but not only for his writing, but because of his fight against colonization, colonialism. And every Samoan school child studies Robert Louis Stevenson's stories. Everybody knows him. They talk about him as if he'd just walked out of the room. They call him Robert Louis. Not Robert Louis, Robert Louis. They know how to pronounce his name because they say it often. They know he's Scottish, but for them, he's a Samoan writer. And Scottish settlers, as you all know, have not always had benign effects. So we're quite rightly, I think, uneasy about imposing our culture on other countries. But like it or not, when we go overseas, that is part of what internationalization involves, a search for shared values. And I'll give you an example. My partner Zoe Strachan and I, some years ago, we spent some time in America with an Iraqi writer. And we got on really well, and after a couple of weeks of eating together, talking about life, talking about literature, he asked if Zoe and I had ever considered getting married. People ask this all the time. And I said, well, we talk about it, you know. Don't tell Zoe I told you this, by the way. I said, we talk about it. And Zoe quite likes the idea, but I'm not so keen on the concept of marriage. I think it's a capitalistic construct. And the Iraqi writer said, yeah, I can see where you're coming from. Marriage is not for everyone. So he asked me, what will you do, Louise, when Zoe gets married? Will you go back and live in your parents' house? So this is not unusual, really. All around the world, people in many countries have never knowingly met a gay person. And Scottish queer writers, of course, have the freedom to allow ourselves to be seen, sometimes even in places that are hostile to homosexuality. And perhaps, I don't know, perhaps that helps change some attitudes. Perhaps it gives some hope to people who cannot allow themselves to be seen. Do gay people live in a separate town in Scotland? A young man asked me in Chengdu. No, I said. We live more or less where we want. Francis Bickmore mentioned empathy, and I think sharing work, sharing discussions, reading other people's lives, even people who we're never going to meet from places that we may never travel to, fosters, of course it does, empathy. And at a time when many countries are turning inwards and internationalization seems to be increasingly unpopular, it's vitally important that we in Scotland continue to engage with folk around the world. Maybe we should just say with each other across the globe. Because in doing so, we foster empathy, we foster new networks, exchanges, contacts, and creativity. Personally, I believe in art for art's sake. But I do recognise that cultural exchange can push open doors. It helps to promote friendly feeling between nations, and it enables dialogues that extend beyond the cultural sphere. And I'm sure many people in the room will have had experience of that. Writers and artists, I guess because typically we make very little money. We've been talking about celebrating huge bestsellers and so forth, but most of us don't make a huge amount of money, and perhaps because of that, we can be brave, we're independent, no one's going to sack us. We can enable difficult discussions to take place across nations. And the example for me is the increasing acknowledgement of Scotland's involvement in the North Atlantic slave trade, which was driven not only largely, I would say, by independent historians, but by artists and writers who took the initiative to collaborate with their counterparts in the Caribbean, and who've managed to build ongoing professional relationships and real friendships out of very, very troubled history. None of this would be possible without brave funders. And we need their bravery. We need them to continue to step beyond what they know will be popular and fund voices that might not otherwise be heard. And with their help and initiatives such as Scottish Pen's Many Voices project, our shared literature will increase in diversity. And maybe the next time we meet, when we look around, you'll see a wee bit more of that in this room. Internationalization is all about exchange. I'm a professor of creative writing at the University of Glasgow. I only work one day a week, but I'm a professor all the time, even when I'm sleeping. We've had a great series of public events free to those who come through the door. We've welcomed writers from the Caribbean, Zimbabwe, Egypt, Nigeria, United States, New Zealand, Pakistan, and elsewhere. I can't remember all the places that people have come to us from. In association with colleagues in the College of Arts, we're hoping to host a refugee writer via the United Nations Protection Fund. We've also established the Workshop for Potential Scottish Literature, which hosted discussions between creative writing programmes across Scotland with a view to establishing a network which can jointly host international writers and offer them public readings across the country. Initiatives like this actually aren't unusual in Scotland. They're happening all around our country. And Adrian already mentioned my friends at the Ullapool Book Festival, who every year welcome a Canadian author, strengthening existing ties between the Highlands and Nova Scotia. So I think of them. I think of the Scottish Poetry Library, who are a hive of international activity. I think of Cove Park International Writers' Residency, who've opened a translation centre. I think of Publishing Scotland, who fund the translation of works from Scotland and abroad. I think of Glasgow Women's Library, who welcome women writers from across the world. I think, of course, of the Edinburgh International Book Festival and the 45+ festivals across Scotland, who open their doors to writers from overseas and allow us to find their work. "I like your country," a man in Serbia said to me. "Your people know how to hate." So not everybody gets us. Not everybody knows what Scotland is about. And to paraphrase the National Museum of Scotland, we need to continue to take the world to Scotland, Scotland to the world. And that world, as we all know, is changing. Perhaps Scotland is repositioning itself. Perhaps we should start to think about tilting the geographic axis. 2018 is the year of homecoming. It's the point where we welcome visitors from America, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and we are very pleased to see them. But I suggest, and we have lots of people in this room who have the power to issue invitations, I suggest we reach out to our brothers and sisters in the Caribbean. All those Watsons, McGregors, Mackays, the Stewarts, the Lamonts. Let's invite them to the Cabaret. Let's invite them to be part of our homecoming celebration. We've got shared blood. Let's expand our national family and welcome them here too. Thank you very much.